there's this saying which says the last best experience is your next expectation. If I can order, a burger on Uber Eats and get it delivered to my mouth within 30 minutes, why can't I do that with a pair of socks or a pallet of goods I'm going to sell tomorrow?
I blame Domino's for this. You buy like a $10 pizza and you basically get a photo of it as it comes out of the oven, and you can just about track the heart rate of your driver as it comes. No wonder people are starting to expect more for a pallet of frozen seafood. Hey guys, I'm Shaun Hagen and welcome to This Week in Logistics. Today I have a special guest joining me again. I have Rob from Shippit joining us for today's episode. So the last 2 months, we've been tracking a lot of the themes around the fuel crisis. So geopolitical disruption, fuel volatility, and surcharge pressures. And today we've got an expert who's right in the industry with me, who's going to come and add his perspective to the conversation today. So to start with, Rob, I might get you just to introduce yourself, a little bit about your role and what Shippit does.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Rob Hango-Zada. Thanks for having me, Shaun. I am the co-founder and joint CEO of a company called Shippit. Shippit was launched about 11 years ago this month, actually. And we set out to kill the missed delivery calling card. I think 11 years later, we're now powering about 100 million deliveries a year. We do that across our commerce delivery platform, which connects retailers to carriers and gives a better customer experience to the end receiver. In the age of Amazon, it's helping retailers like Kmart, Myer, and Big W and the like compete effectively. And we've also got a driver technology application called NowGo, which helps any business who has its own fleet reliably deliver to their customers and optimize their routes and costs accordingly. So in this age of efficiency, it's a very much needed capability for business.
Just a couple of areas to help the supply chain then, Rob. So obviously you have from that sort of lens, you have a great vantage point, I think, across multiple touch points in supply chain. Obviously a lot around the last mile and fulfillment, and very topically the areas that are getting the most impacted by the fuel crisis. So I'm interested from your perspective, given that you do get to see this from both the retailer and the carrier side, from your perspective, what's actually been happening over the last couple of months, and what's it felt like for your customer base?
Look, the squeeze continues. I think it's the age of efficiency, which we've entered into. So if we kind of like chart the course backwards, we had the glory heady days for e-commerce, at least, not for the health sector and the general population, but for at least e-commerce and logistics, the heady days of COVID and what transpired there and digital transformation. And then the elastic band kind of slunk right back and contracted. And we've been seeing retailers and logistics carriers sort of facing increased pricing pressures, be it labor costs, be it real estate costs, be it the cost of capital, and now fuel costs. It just seems like nobody can catch a break. So the last couple of months have been quite intense. I think what it's exposed, at least from what we've seen in the industry, is the traditional model for logistics is a little bit set and forget. You negotiate your rates with a carrier once per year. You have a static rate card that sits in place. And then, as of 5 years ago, or a little bit longer now, fuel surcharges were introduced to recover the increasing cost of fuel in terms of the operation. But what we've seen is carriers are now, rolling out surcharges that retailers just really have a lack of awareness around. And particularly in B2C, it's interesting because you've got fluctuations in demand. And obviously when that happens at the same time as increases in surcharges like the fuel surcharge, you tend to find that profitability takes a major hit, and those impacts are felt after the fact, not in real time. And so the decision making comes with a bit of lag and fatigue, and that's something that retailers are really struggling with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit on a really good point that it's been an interesting couple of years to be in and around sort of supply chain where, I also feel the same. It feels a bit awkward to be like, hey, actually we had tailwinds through COVID. Obviously, no one wants to go through that again, but on the headline, we've had sort of volume increases, there's all sorts of stats like 20% of retail online and, 7-8% volume increases. So the headline numbers look pretty good in some spaces, but yeah, I think across the board, it's been getting harder and harder for operators, and the fuel surcharge is definitely just one. And over the last, I think, few weeks, it has been I think we saw on the show the last couple of weeks has been like the invoices come due. Some of those fluctuations have started to kind of hit, accounts receivable, accounts payable, and sort of sharpen some of those conversations. So like, have you seen that, I guess, then, now that that is sort of getting through to the consumer, who does have some sensitivity to demand and maybe a lag on pricing, have you seen that change anything about the way that retailers think about the carrier mix, or their sort of their relationship with that? Has sort of had any impacts that you've seen so far?
We've certainly seen a bit of an increase in curiosity, at least from multiple carriers. So the multi-carrier mix was, it was probably the strongest leading into COVID and then coming through COVID, where carrier liquidity or the capacity for carriers was quite limited and constrained. And I think as those carriers have kind of caught up by building additional capacity, they're desperate to lock volume in to achieve the base loads that they need and ensure the profitability of their enterprise. So we've seen, kind of a return to the norm of single carrier dependency. And when you see things like surcharges get rolled out, those retailers who have not made decisions to adopt more flexibility, and I'm quite biased, it's something that we enable. They find themselves locked in to one carrier and they've got no leverage. Whereas those that have a more dynamic approach to shipping, they appreciate that having optionality affords them, that ability to navigate away from heightened costs when you're sort of backed against a corner. So I think seeking out ways for greater leverage in your carrier mix is something that we've seen retailers sort of coming to Shippit to understand. And obviously our existing customer base have also been looking for supplementation to drive either a better customer experience overall or to, in fact, reduce their costs.
Out of interest, from again, given that you do get to see such a broad cross section of the carrier market, we obviously have seen the Australian government sort of rolling out some, mandated sort of fuel surcharge pass on legislation. Have you seen much variety in the way that carriers have been responding, or have you seen that converging on a particular approach?
It's really bizarre. I mean, the lack of regulation and transparency and pricing is immense in the carrier industry. I think we have a few people in our business that have come from the travel industry, and that's come under a lot of scrutiny because it's such a big consumer facing issue. Whereas in the B2B landscape, carrier pricing is a little cloak and dagger, to be honest. There's a lack of transparency.
Yeah.
We even started to put a bit of transparency around the fuel surcharges with a matrix out to market, and the backlash from carriers was quite intense because we're actually shining a light on this. But the reality is the fuel surcharge that is passed on to one business might not be the fuel surcharge passed on to another business. And the methodologies that each carrier uses is quite unique. So it feels a little unfair for a carrier when, they've got a 43% fuel surcharge and they're sitting next to a competitor who's only rolled out a 12% fuel surcharge. So the short answer is lack of transparency and a hell of a lot of inconsistency.
Yeah, it's funny. We obviously we sit very close to each other in the supply chain, and I think having that cross section of both warehousing and transport, we've seen a couple of things similar to sort of something you alluded to there. We've seen some pockets where people maybe differentiated on the way that they incorporated fuel into their rates, which was fine when fuel's predictable, but sort of all of a sudden not fine when things get more volatile. But you've hit the nail on the head. Like the big thing that we've been seeing has been the transparency, just being able to explain the charge through that, through that sort of delivery process, however many people that touches, trying to get that transparency is sort of step one. And then you can work out who can pass on what to who through that. But yeah, it's been an interesting challenge. It certainly does feel like there's potentially a better way of doing this, but hopefully we can find it over the next couple of months. What about from the consumer behavior perspective? Again, that's probably something that we see sort of a bit further removed than you guys. But I'm interested to see, have you seen any changes in preferences or options or anything that you can see at the point of sort of order that has been changing to sort of preferences or volumes or anything like that?
Yeah, we've certainly seen a pretty substantial increase in what we'd call sort of on-demand or same or next day kind of delivery preferences amongst the consumer.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
Historically, there was a belief that you could charge a consumer for a faster delivery. And whilst the retail industry was really upset with Amazon for establishing the free shipping, expectation for the world, so not only had retailers, felt like they'd caught up with the free shipping piece, which was okay, we're going to offer free shipping at a threshold, or just blanket free shipping, and kind of work out the economic impact later. But now what we've seen is with the rise of Amazon, particularly in Australia, it's definitely normalized an expectation that whatever you want from wherever it comes from should arrive on your doorstep within 24 hours of you clicking buy now. And that is a very unfair expectation on the general population of retailers that just haven't built a supply chain capability like Amazon have, and don't have the bank balance accordingly. So we've seen an increase, particularly amongst Gen Z, of consumers who expect the Amazon-like experience of every retailer, and they don't want to pay for it. And that's quite challenging, but it is reflected in the delivery data that we see in terms of the rise of on-demand or same or next day shipping capabilities. So we call that fast local delivery. I think the other piece there is, we've observed an increasing gap between what a retailer is able to articulate as their delivery proposition on a checkout page or a product page. So say, for example, they say, hey, if you order now, you'll get it within 5 to 7 business days. When you actually look at the data in terms of the delivery capability of the courier companies, they're delivering in under 2 business days from the time they collect. And so this vast disconnect of around 3 days of transit is sucked into what we call the fulfillment bottleneck, or the fact that we're working around rigid hours. So I talked about business hours for a courier because that's the way the courier industry has always been built. We start looking at diversified delivery models like Uber, Sherpa, DoorDash, and these really sort of gig economy driven models, and their price is the same regardless of whether it's a Saturday, a Sunday, a Monday, or a Friday. And so we're seeing this disconnect now starting to come to light because the consumer expectation has increased.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you mentioned, that's certainly it had some different options coming into the traditional carrier mix as well. I think what we've also seen is that e-commerce bleed into B2B, where if your expectations are set by buying a $50 t-shirt, if you buy a $5,000 pallet of goods, you kind of expect something comparable in terms of visibility, service, delivery timeframe. So yeah, we've certainly seen that same trend. You mentioned,
I often,
oh, sorry, jump in, Rob. Sorry.
no, sure. Like just on that point, Sean, I quietly sort of reflect on that one. There's this saying which says the last best experience is your next expectation. And it's really a fair comparison because, if I can order, a burger on Uber Eats and get it delivered to my mouth within 30 minutes, why can't I do that with a pair of socks or a pallet of goods I'm going to sell tomorrow? I think, that subconscious training of the consumer, whether they're in the B2B or B2C landscape, is definitely being driven by consumer technology and the advances on that front, be it Amazon, Uber, or the like. Sorry, Sean. Yeah, back to you.
No, you're 100% right. I actually blame back in the day. I blame Domino's for this. I don't know if it wasn't necessarily I wasn't necessarily a regular customer, but you buy like a $10 pizza and you basically get a photo of it as it comes out of the oven, and you can just about track the heart rate of your driver as it comes, live.
That's exactly right.
I'm like, okay, no wonder people are starting to expect more for a pallet of frozen seafood.
Yeah.
But we'll see where we land. I think there was a little bit of a little bit of a repositioning, and ours is a big one. I think as you get to B2B, where like speed is also being matched with convenience, where I think consumers, there has been examples I think where consumers have been a little bit more flexible about their delivery expectations if they can have more certainty over when and how it's going to arrive for them. If they can say pick an afternoon that they're at home versus the fastest delivery, I think there has been, but that has obviously another sort of trickle-on effect of complexity that people need to sort of manage from a supply chain bottleneck perspective. You did mention something we've been talking about on the show the last couple of weeks in Amazon. Obviously, Amazon in the e-commerce fulfillment space has been omnipresent and has recently announced its entry into the B2B space. We saw in North America that had an immediate impact on some of the North American carriers as well. I'm interested from the ANZ perspective, from that retail and last mile perspective. have you got any sort of insights in terms of how customers that you're working with are thinking about that, at that Amazon option now?
Yeah, there's definitely a rise in it. Literally, on a lot of strategy papers, it's how do we deliver an Amazon-like experience. I think it's that's the language that people are using now, um, and I think the only caveat or carve out that a lot of retailers are trying to leverage there is at the right price. I think so it's really a balance of investment. I think what a lot of retailers are struggling with is their ambition is far greater than their appetite to invest. And that really is a big concern for the industry. I hold a lot of roundtables with executive leaders, and the biggest question I get asked is, how do we convince our board or how do we convince our logistics team that this is a worthy investment? The numbers aren't as clear, right? You've got to almost sort of stick your neck out to be able to invest in these capabilities. So when you're thinking about the Amazon-like experience, let's break it down a little bit. It means fast delivery. So, yep, we're going to find a carrier that can do a same day or next day delivery at an economical sort of price. Yep, tick. Lots of those options exist in the market, but that's not where the pressure is. The pressure is in the upstream capabilities and systems of a retailer. So this is where Amazon has a hell of a lot of automation, data, insight, and predictability around their model. A lot of retailers are still operating from the offline world, moving into the online world. So they've got, old school point of sale systems, ERPs, order management systems. Some of those retailers don't actually know where the inventory is in their network until after a purchase has been made. And then they also aren't very crisp or clear on the SLAs because you've got a bunch of humans doing the fulfillment in store locations or warehouse locations. And it's a bit of a spaghetti monster. So I think, when you start looking at ironing out all those kinks and you look at the investment that's required, we're talking about major uplifts in inventory management, order management, point of sale, and warehouse automation. And each one of those projects I've just rattled off are usually a 5-year sort of CapEx cycle, right? So we're asking retailers to do that now. And just adding an on-demand option looks like the easy optical way to sort of achieve an Amazon-like experience, but it actually is a greater transformation for a business. When I talk about the appetite to invest, I talk about the short-termism that's entered our markets in the age of efficiency. So a lot of businesses, particularly if they're listed, cost of capital is high. And what's the number one thing we can do to increase enterprise value? We can reduce cost. So there are a very limited set of businesses that are willing to invest deeply right now that's going to affect their financial position and therefore their share price because they can't demonstrate the conviction they have with some of these transformations. Now, that being said, it's not all doom and gloom. There are a few retailers that have done this. One of the retailers we've worked with is PetBarn. They've invested in a long-term strategy and they can now pick, pack, and ship an order within, 5 minutes of it being placed at their checkout. And that reliably builds trust. And that's, leveraging their entire store network and the service-led culture of their people, which is a vastly different, sort of approach to what we're seeing in a lot of other retailers. They're like, hey, we've got this Amazon-like experience. Can you just add another carrier for us? Oh, do we really want to pay for a shipping platform? Oh, OMS, ERP. Yeah, we're not really going to touch that for the next 5 years. So it's almost like, well, we can't help you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we've sort of been saying is, that a technology like amplifies a good operation, doesn't fix a broken one. And it has been incredible seeing the success of places like PetBarn. They also have that advantage that not everyone gets, where they have like relatively predictable like order profile and the types of goods that they have the ability to invest in automation. Obviously, looking at other sectors of the supply chain, they may not have that ability. We've seen, I think, with some of the robotics and some of the automation and AI getting to more point-based solutions, that impatience has gone up because I think to an extent you also don't want to procure something now that's going to be live in 5 years because you think the technology has moved, but also you expect an ROI in 6 months. I don't disagree with that perspective, but I do appreciate that it does sort of preclude you from being able to kind of really deliver a seamless end-to-end order. So it's fantastic to hear that success story across PetBarn. Has there been any other areas that I think, maybe on the sort of the short of the medium time frame, has there been other areas where you've seen that technology has been kind of, I guess, making a difference, amplifying good operations or what that opportunity looks like?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of businesses that are either struggling to adopt AI or adopting AI in a really clever way. And I think, there's a couple of areas where we're seeing, there's some basic technology. I think like the easy wins are, um, you know, probably just in terms of surfacing up the data that you already have in your network. I think a lot of retailers underestimate the capabilities of the systems that they have today. We worked with a retailer a few years ago, and often faced with this juncture, this sort of junction in the road, this fork in the road to say, hey, we need to uplift our inventory visibility. Well, let's go down this path of speaking to a brand new ERP vendor, and they're selling us all this amazing stuff. And then you go and blow the dust off the user manuals of the old ERP, and you go, hey, actually, we've got a live feed that comes through a CSV. Maybe we can punch a hole in this system and actually expose that. Maybe we can work around it. And it actually worked for them. So there are a lot of shortcuts that you can kind of take to get you to the outcome without needing to necessarily go down these big reinvention paths. So I think that's a definite easy win. And I think it's the advice we often give to retailers is really challenge your vendors and challenge your SIs or your internal teams to see how you can get them to work together. On the point of AI, I think being able to move into more of a dynamic sort of capability. So as I talked about at the start of this sort of podcast, was there is a view that we draw up a very static agreement at the start of a year with a carrier and the delivery options and the like, but there is a lack of dynamism. And I think what we're seeing now is there is a need to actually better connect all the technologies in the supply chain. Why can't a carrier, tell a retailer when they've got spare capacity in their vans that they can actually drop their price and take on more volume? Why can't they actually increase the price when they actually have too much to deliver, because it increases the reliability of that delivery experience? So that really is not a capability that exists today, but there are technologies that provide real-time, estimated delivery dates at checkout. We've just sort of entered that landscape as well. And there's obviously the route optimization and live capacity management, which we've sort of stepped into. And there's obviously, what you guys are doing at Carton Cloud around, how do you optimize that fulfillment process in warehouse and the like. So I think the connected supply chain is what we're seeing as a big emerging trend, and making sure that each system in that supply chain speaks to one another without it necessarily sitting in silos like it used to.
Absolutely. And it's probably one of those areas that, again, Uber's kind of training us to expect that surge pricing and sort of, demand-led sort of variable pricing. But interestingly, it's probably one of the few areas that I think potentially you could argue the B2B, LTL or FTL freight community is potentially leading, where there's been a little bit more collaboration around capacity planning and sort of backload management and sort of freight consolidation. Obviously, it's a little bit easier when the volume's a bit lower, and that's where I think obviously the automation and the software has to come in, whether with whatever data you've got available, to enable someone who's handling e-commerce volumes, as a retailer, to be able to really make some inroads there. Rob, sort of, I guess what we sort of try and sort of, wrap up with a little bit is probably a bit more of a forward-looking lens. So obviously, you guys are really, I think, blazing the way in our industry, working with retailers, adding a lot of value. I've got two final questions to wrap up with. And then the first one is, if you were speaking to a customer or prospect or a retailer coming in to talk to you now who's feeling the pressure, what would you be advising them to do over the next 30 to 60 days?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Shaun. I have to think about that one. It depends, right? And the reason why it depends is because there's not a one size fits all. And I think that's where a lot of retailers fall into a bit of a trap. They're unfairly comparing themselves against something that they really should not be. Um, I take us back to, a few examples over the years where a retailer has tried to enter a race which they're probably not prepared to really take on, and sustain. You think about the catch marketplace, you think about, a bunch of larger retailers that have been winding up lately. That's because they got this proposition wrong. I think the grid that I usually draw is, it's a 2x2, which looks at the proximity that a consumer is to a dispatch location. And the other one, which is probably more important, is range breadth. If you don't have a very broad range, let's say you sell ovens, right? And that's all you sell. The frequency of purchase of an oven is pretty low. Like, you're going to keep that oven for 10 years. Unless you're moving house, you're not buying another oven. And so the purchase decision is not necessarily about how cheap was that delivery. It is about reliability above all
Mm.
else. But you don't necessarily need to give that away. Now, if you're in the business of selling fruit and vegetables, it is about the speed, certainty, and that repeatability of purchase that's super important. So that ultimately becomes a really important thing to do. So I guess the first question I ask a lot of retailers is, well, where do they fit within that grid? And then you start to build out your delivery proposition and your fulfillment proposition from there. The next piece is really, what do your existing technologies allow you to do that you never thought they could? So it's really about challenging the art of what's possible, but being very clever with how it's informed. So if we think about the path to consumer expectation delivery, we think about, okay, can we offer a level of certainty in that delivery experience? And you work backwards and say, right, what are the contingencies around this throughout our supply chain, and where can we actually harden those processes internally? So this is all before you even thought about technology. And then the next piece is then to say, okay, what does my consumer expect, and what do my competitors offer that I don't? And it may well be sorting out your pricing. It may well be adding a delivery option, and it may well be looking at your returns capability. Because these is all the things that are really important in that sort of evaluation for a consumer. The next bit that we then go down is, okay, well, how do you treat delivery as a cost to your business? I think if we come from the B2B world, it very much is a cost of doing business. We typically pass that cost of doing business onto the receiver. There's a known habit in the industry to sort of absorb that cost, receiver pays. In the consumer industry, it's the flip. So we've rolled the same accounting principle for delivery cost absorption or logistics costs. But actually, when you think about it in this current age, a very reliable or fast delivery experience leads to repeat purchase. It's actually as valuable as your loyalty program or as your marketing spend. So how do you treat delivery spend as an investment in loyalty? And that helps to unlock a lot more funding for a business.
But unintentionally, it hit a soft spot. It's not an oven, but I am currently 5 months into trying to get an ottoman delivered. And despite trying to negotiate with the logistics team to pay more so I can just get it delivered in a particular time window, I am unsuccessful. So I can personally vouch for that fact, Rob, that that is having a significantly bigger impact on my loyalty. I will not name the retailers, but if any big box furniture retailers are out there listening, think it might be them, then you should do something about it. Before I move on to the last question, you actually mentioned something I meant to ask earlier. We haven't really talked much about returns on this week in logistics, and you just mentioned it there. Now, obviously, one of the other things Amazon did in addition to normalizing free delivery was normalizing free returns as well, and especially now where shipping costs are really high, margins are obviously pretty tight. Have you seen anything yet that where returns have been affecting retailers in terms of like their margin or their offerings, what they're actually prepared to provide to customers?
Yeah, it's you should have done a listener discretion warning. Returns is such a dirty word for a lot of listeners, right? I think it's it is a massive black hole potentially, but it's such an important part of the consumer proposition. And even if I reflect on my own Amazon returns experiences, it's a horrible experience. Like when you're not returning it to a drop off point and you're waiting for a courier to come and collect one parcel up from your residential home, it's not going to happen. So Amazon may as well just write that product off. Then we've got to talk about the environmental impact. We've got to talk about the cost impact. The fact that I think one of the large sort of fashion marketplaces in Australia had a return rate of over 30%. But the average time to return was, call it a month. And what happens in that month is you've got to overbuy inventory to sell whilst you're waiting for products to be returned. And in a seasonal area or a seasonal sector, you can't do anything with those products but sell them on clearance or try and offload them as wastage. So there's a real problem. I think what we've seen retailers do over the last sort of 5 years is still offer easy returns, what we call easy returns. So you don't need to like download a PDF, fill that out, scan it in, email it through, and wait 6 business days for a response and get a label and figure all that rigmarole out. It is literally, I can initiate a return, it can be approved or rejected in real time, and I can pay for that return. But overwhelmingly we're seeing a move or a shift from retailers. Rather than offer up a straight refund, they're incentivizing store credit. So once they have, accepted your cash into their business, they want to hold it there and encourage you to rebuy or treat it like a gift card. And so there's often incentives provided around that. But we do recommend easy returns is the first thing, and the second thing is cost recovery on return is not a bad thing to do. That ultimately relies on more accurate information, more accurate pack shots, and a higher quality of description of those products so that the customer is not upset.
Yeah, absolutely. There's obviously multiple ways you can end up at that return point, and it doesn't necessarily, mean that anyone's done anything wrong. But yeah, trying to make that an easy and seamless process certainly helps to what you mentioned before about building and maintaining brand loyalty. Right, the last one here, Rob. Before we finish up, we've talked a lot about pressure. Such has been the times. So the last few months, there has been headwinds and challenges. If we were maybe to spin things a little more positively, what are you excited about in the delivery and logistics space over the next 6 to 12 months?
Look, I am genuinely excited about the level of sophistication we're seeing in the market at the moment. A lot of retailers have woken up to kind of where they need to take the industry, and they're looking to sort of lead the pack, which is quite exciting. A few years ago, every conversation we had was about price. Can you give me a cheaper delivery cost? Can you give me a better cost than that? No, I need more savings. And their business case was very contingent on that. And what we're seeing now is the business case is more linked to customer benefit, which is quite exciting. But that means that the average delivery experience for the consumer is actually improving, and that's quite exciting. And we're seeing a lot more, sort of collaboration from industry players. So historically, freight players are very closed doors, if that makes sense. There's not a lot of collaboration that happens within the courier industry for fear of collusion and fear of kind of losing out because it's such a tight margin game. But given the state of the industry and the available capacity and the lack of demand that's hit their networks, there is an openness to wanting to collaborate a lot more. And that will do wonders for the environment, and it will do wonders for pricing to the consumer. And so we're pretty excited about those two big things. So hopefully we see cost pressures easing, and then we see the retailers that have invested in these things actually start to accelerate rather than deteriorate against Amazon. But that's the hopeful outlook.
I love it, Rob. I think that's a great place to leave it. I really appreciate you coming on today. You've said it all. You've been a wonderful guest. Thank you very much for making the time, and everyone else, enjoy the rest of your weeks. We'll be back next week for one of our regular episodes. Rob, thanks for joining us. Everyone else, we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Shaun.